The radio tower was calling all certified aircraft. Flash flood warnings, crosswinds above 70 knots. Nobody had landed in hours. They'd launched the high-speed jets first, fast, clean, tactical, but none of them touched the ground. At the edge of the gravel runway, an old waterplane sat in silence. No insignia, no crew. Just a woman tightening the buckles on her own vest. Her name wasn't on the manifest. She didn't wait for permission. The morning heat clung to the airfield before the sun even finished rising. Waves of warmth shimmered off the concrete, distorting the outlines of tents, crates, and wings. Behind the operations tent, a line of cargo jets gleamed under spotlights, each surrounded by clusters of crew in fresh vests and mirrored sunglasses. There were water bottles in holsters, tablets in hand, branded patches on every shoulder. Conversations overlapped weather reports, call signs, and flight clearance chatter mixing with laughter that carried too easily across the open space. Clara stood near the edge of the pad, boots scuffed, laces bleached white from years of sun. Her flight cap was tucked low against the glare. She held a clipboard in both hands, knuckles slightly pale from the grip, the edges of the paper fluttering gently in the crosswind. The map she'd drawn herself coastline traced in pencil. Elevation routes marked by feel rather than forecast was already damp at the corners, but the lines held. They always did. Just behind her, her waterplane sat still. Its hull wore streaks of old salt and peeled paint, the number 133 stenciled in block font across the tail. The pontoons bore scratches that hadn't been sanded down in years. The glass was fogged in patches. No one approached it. No one asked questions. Colonel Adrian stood at the center of the tented circle, sleeves rolled, voice clipped. First wave departs at 0900, he said. 3 flight groups, 5 aircraft each. Drops begin over Sector Delta. He pointed to a printed overlay pinned on a corkboard. Around him, heads nodded, and styluses tapped screens in practiced rhythm. A younger pilot stepped forward. Derek, slim build, flight suit zipped just low enough to show a branded training shirt underneath. His smile was perfect, his voice louder than necessary. Press crew is riding with us, he said, gesturing to the sleek turboprop behind him. Full comms setup. Dual camera feeds. We'll go wheels up just before sunbreak and catch the ridge lighting. A smattering of grins followed. Someone from logistics gave a thumbs up. A French liaison in wraparound shades murmured something approving to his translator. At the far edge, near the supply crates, a woman with a media badge adjusted her camera lens and said, "Let's make sure our visuals aren't blocked by non-essential aircraft during rollout." She looked straight past Clara, but the meaning settled plainly. Clara stepped forward, quiet but deliberate. "The coast bend here," she said, tapping a point on her map. "The channel between the low ridges, it's still passable by shallow draft. If the wind shifts again, you'll need to drop south, not east." Colonel Adrian didn't look at her. "Let's stick to approved maps, please." Derek didn't move, but his eyes flicked down at her clipboard and back up with amusement. Hand-drawn charts. "You get those from the tourist hut." Clara didn't respond. She turned slightly, offering the paper again. "It's based on last season's patterns. The post-cyclone breakwater moved inland by 7 meters. "Who logged it?" Adrian asked, still without looking directly at her. Clara paused. "I did." There was a silence. Then someone near the fuel tent coughed into their sleeve. A radio chirped, briefly drowning the sound. The moment passed. Adrian glanced toward one of the junior officers. "Is she on the roster?" The officer checked the clipboard. "No, sir. She's ground listed. No manifest slot." Derek chuckled. "Guess we've got extra eyes on deck. Maybe bring her along for shade." The media officer with the tablet turned, sweeping her hand in a polite, dismissive gesture. "Can we get her moved to the background? We've got a wide shot setting up and need clean lines." Clara stepped back without a word. She folded the map and tucked it under her arm. The clipboard stayed in her hand. She didn't glance at the group again. Her face was still, unreadable, eyes on the ground as she turned toward her aircraft. Behind her, the group reassembled. New calls were issued. Timelines adjusted. The glossy turboprop engines began spinning slowly, then faster, the hum building into a sharp mechanical crescendo. A ground crew member signaled with a bright orange wand. Someone cheered lightly when the blades cut through a wave of cloudless blue. The concrete shimmered again. Clara's shadow stretched long and thin ahead of her. Her boots thudded gently with each step as she crossed back toward the forgotten end of the line. There were no other aircraft beside hers, no ground team, no press crew, just the sound of her own steps and the faint creak of a wing brace settling in the heat. She reached the side ladder and rested her hand on the metal. The skin of the plane was warm beneath her palm. She didn't climb in. Not yet. She turned and looked back once, over the field, across the shining line of parked jets and fluttering flags. The tent flaps moved in the breeze. Cameras clicked. Voices rose again. No one looked her way. Above the noise, the polished turboprop lifted off. The shadow it cast slid long across the hangars, then passed. Clara didn't watch it go. She stepped up into the aircraft and disappeared inside. The door closed without sound. The wind lifted a corner of her flight tarp and dropped it again. The field resumed its rhythm, loud, confident, and sure of itself. The hangar stood in shadow, half drowned in old rainwater and long-forgotten tools. Its corrugated walls bore the orange smears of rust that had settled in over decades, and the roof sagged slightly near the middle, where last season's storm had peeled a panel loose. Grass had begun to push up through cracks in the concrete floor, not in defiance, but in quiet persistence. The far edge of the pad was soft with runoff, and the tailwheel of the waterplane left a thin arc in the mud when the wind nudged it forward by inches. Clara moved inside with the ease of someone who had been here 100 times before. She did not fumble. She did not pause. The space was still, warm with the dull breath of a trapped afternoon, and the air carried the faint smells of old fuel, frayed canvas, and waterlogged wood. She closed the side panel and let the latch settle without a sound. Her footsteps echoed lightly over the floor as she moved along the aircraft's hull. On the far wall, a glove hung from a rusted nail, its leather dried and cracked along the fingers. Beside it, a metal clipboard bore the curled edge of a taped photo, Clara's waterplane, caught in grainy light above a river bend, its tail number barely visible but unmistakable. 133. The same number stenciled now on the aircraft behind her, though the paint had long since faded to a dull, patchy gray. In the photo, the wings looked almost defiant, proud and clean. That version of the plane had flown under her father's hands. She took a soft cloth and began wiping down the main strut. One swipe at a time. Dirt lifted in thin layers, revealing rivets that held firm even after years of neglect. The act wasn't mechanical. It was ceremonial, quiet, and specific. Her father had taught her to prep the airframe not as checklist, but as conversation. He used to say the plane would answer if you listened close enough. Beside the toolbox sat the map board, a flat panel salvaged from a retired chart table and mounted against the interior wall. The corners were reinforced with strips of weathered canvas, stitched by hand. On it lay a sheet of yellowed paper marked in thick pencil. The route lines ran jagged but deliberate, elevations annotated in her father's handwriting. Several of the turns had been adjusted more recently. Clara's additions, sharp and spare. She had traced the shifting coastline after each storm. She knew where the water broke and where it held, not because a satellite told her, but because she had seen it. She tapped one section with her knuckle, the point where the ridge dipped closest to the floodplain. It was labeled only once, in small, square letters, safe water. She traced the curve again with her fingertip, then reached for the grease pencil still tucked into a magnet clip. The metal clicked when she pulled it loose. It fit perfectly between her fingers. Outside, a jet engine rose into the sky, distant but clear. Its tone was clean, well-tuned, sharpened by instruments and funding. Clara did not turn to look. She continued checking the pontoons, testing each tie with a practiced pull, sliding a flat bar beneath the strap to feel for softness. She shifted weight against the lower hull and listened to how the frame answered. It didn't creak. That meant it was still sound. The cargo crates waited beside the hangar door, their wood darkened by damp air. She rolled up her sleeves and lifted the first one with a steady grip. It bore the word water, marked in charcoal across the side. No stencils, no labels, just a handwritten truth. She loaded it carefully into the bay and braced it with a double-wrapped strap. The second crate was smaller, filled with packets of dried rice. She nested it against the left bulkhead and locked it down with a net looped through 6 anchor points. The final crate was marked antibiotics. She paused before moving it, not out of hesitation, but to wipe her palms against her pants. She moved it slower than the others. The latch on the storage hatch was stiff, and she leaned into it until the bolt gave, with a muted click. The crate slid into place without scraping. She patted it with old life vests folded flat for cushion. When she finished, she stepped back, arms loose at her sides, breathing quiet, but even. There was a rhythm to it all. No checklist, no timer, just a sequence built from years of need and memory. She reached under the pilot seat and pulled out a roll of cloth. Inside were tools she had wrapped the same way for 10 years: pliers, a multi-head wrench, a worn screwdriver with one side dulled smooth. She checked the emergency crank for the rear hatch, oiled the throttle slide, and replaced a frayed bit of cord that held the left radio dial in place. Her eyes landed on the altimeter. The crack across its face was unchanged. It had failed once on a run over the northern islands, during a squall that knocked power from the port side panel. She had landed by instinct then, by cloud thickness and wave pitch. She had not replaced it. It hung there now as reminder, not warning. She stepped back into the hangar and took the map from the board. With the grease pencil in hand, she made one last mark, a clean line from the southern shelf to the schoolyard ridge, with an arrow that curved like a slow river bend. She didn't write anything beside it. She didn't need to. Rolling the paper into a tight scroll, she secured it with a rubber band and tucked it into a waterproof sleeve. That went into the side pouch beneath the seat. She zipped it closed and pressed her palm once against the canvas. Outside, the light had begun to shift. The edges of the clouds turned gold in places where the wind opened gaps. A low gust moved through the open door and stirred the tarp folded on the bench. Clara returned to the crates, checked each strap one last time, then stepped down onto the hangar floor. She stood beside her plane with both hands at her sides, quiet, steady, and ready. No one had called her. No one had listed her name. But the aircraft was loaded. The route was drawn. The door was still open, and the sky was still waiting. Inside the main command tent, the air had gone from busy to brittle. Screens lined the front wall, each flickering with static breaks and grainy overlays from drone footage that was now hours old. Colonel Adrian stood with one hand on the back of a folding chair, the other gripping a radio mic that was no longer responding. His posture hadn't shifted in nearly 5 minutes, and the sweat beneath his collar had darkened into a second shadow. "We've lost signal from the southern corridor," he said without raising his voice. It wasn't news anymore, just confirmation. Around him, the others moved less confidently than they had this morning. A media officer was adjusting the brightness on a tablet that no longer streamed anything useful. One of the junior techs kept tapping the corner of a monitor like it might shake the satellite feed back into place. 2 logistics staff whispered behind a stack of equipment crates, eyes flicking toward the pinned route map beside the folding desk. A red line curved toward the coastline and stopped abruptly at the words, "Primary drop zone." Beyond that point, there was nothing. Derek entered the tent fast, his flight suit halfway unzipped and damp along the spine. His hair was wind-matted and his expression straining against the last threads of arrogance. He threw a pair of headphones down on the nearest crate and looked at Adrian without waiting to be acknowledged. "No good," he said. Visuals broke up 10 clicks out. The cloud shelf dropped under 100.0 meters and the crosswinds snapping like a whip. I had to circle back. Adrian didn't answer. His eyes remained on the largest screen, which now showed a paused live stream frame. It was a high-angle shot of the airfield from earlier in the day, taken by drone for media coverage. A row of aircraft could be seen clearly, lined up and clean. In the far background, barely framed, was a faded seaplane. Its hull reflected no light. Its presence wasn't even centered. A junior officer beside Adrian cleared his throat. Second aircraft from the French crew just radioed in. They're diverting to grid echo. Wind shears pushing over safe limits and their cargo's top-heavy. They can't risk it. Adrian finally turned from the screen. "That's the third withdrawal." The officer nodded. "Yes, sir." Derek stepped closer. Defensive now. "It's not pilot error. It's the weather. There's no safe way through that valley anymore. The breakwater collapsed, and they didn't account for the storm's rebound pattern." Adrian said nothing. He looked at the map again. No one moved to update it. From outside, the wind had picked up. A flap snapped against the side of the tent like a loose sail. The smell of damp fuel drifted in, mixed with the hot breath of the nearby generators. One of the NGO representatives checked his watch, then leaned toward the press coordinator. "We need to start reshaping the statement. Call it a delay for infrastructure review. Say the safety threshold wasn't met for air delivery and we've shifted to ground deployment." The coordinator nodded, typing as she spoke. "Do we blur the grid overlay?" "Just pull it entirely." A second technician tapped his earpiece. Still no return ping from the floodplain beacon. "It's not a signal issue. That tower's down." Adrian's jaw tightened. "Start drafting the abort order for the final wave. Put standby crews on hold." Derek's voice softened, almost too casual. "You think the locals are even going to hear about this today?" "If they're lucky," Adrian muttered. "And if they're not standing on rooftops." No one spoke after that. Far across the field, Clara watched the wind move over the tree line. The hangar stayed quiet behind her. The sky above was gray but stable dense clouds, not yet breaking, but layered in predictable seams. She didn't need radar to read it. Her hand rested on the edge of her flight panel. Fingers curved around the throttle guide as though she were already airborne. Her sleeves were rolled to the elbow. The grease pencil still sat behind her ear. Her boots were wet to the ankle from crossing the drainage path that cut between the hangar and the field. She had walked it slowly, measuring the gusts by how the fabric of her sleeves moved. The plane was ready. It had been ready. There was no ceremony to it. She had tied down the last crate, sealed the hatch, and laid the manual compass by her seat. Inside the cockpit, the radio sat cold and silent. She hadn't turned it on. There was no need. The airfield frequency wasn't calling her. She wasn't on any channel. Back in the command tent, another line of static swept across the main screen. A drone operator reset the feed and tried again. Still nothing. A field medic entered with a clipboard, glanced around, and asked if the landing clearance had gone through. The silence answered before Adrian could. The NGO lead leaned in again. "We need to start framing this differently. Let's talk about tomorrow's plan. Maybe we highlight the forward warehouse staging and say we're prioritizing longevity over spectacle." Someone at the back muttered, "It was never about spectacle." But it had been. They all knew it. At the edge of the hangar, Clara adjusted her cap and stepped into the open door of her plane. The cabin light clicked on with a soft hum. She didn't check the fuel levels again. She had already done it twice. Instead, she sat down in the pilot seat, adjusted the back brace, and fastened the belt in silence. The old map rested in its sleeve beside the control panel. The heading she had marked curved through terrain no one else had considered. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't fast. But it was possible. She reached out and pressed the starter switch. The propeller turned once, then again, then settled into rhythm. In the command tent, the sound was barely audible beneath the whine of monitors and cooling fans. No one turned. No one noticed. She didn't wait for clearance. No one was coming to stop her, and no one was coming to go in her place. Outside, the storm line waited, and she moved toward it. The nose of the waterplane dipped slightly as Clara adjusted the trim. Her fingers moved without hesitation, not searching, not second-guessing. The yoke vibrated softly in her palms, a hum that told her more than any instrument cluster ever had. She didn't look at the altimeter. It had failed years ago, and she hadn't replaced it. What she trusted now was the tone of the engine, the weight of the air, and the way the clouds leaned when they were about to break. Outside, the world narrowed. Rain sheared sideways across the windshield, blurring the horizon into gray sheets that shifted with every gust. The wipers were stuck in place, long since broken, and she had long since stopped caring. The droplets ran in streams, not beads, and she learned to read through them. She leaned slightly to the left and squinted through the side window, watching how the light fractured in the water below. Her map fluttered on the console, pinned by a steel bolt and one strip of old canvas tape. It showed no grid coordinates, no forecast overlays. Just a hand-drawn line that curved like a half-moon through the valley pass and ended at a small X marked safe water. The pencil was dark and thick, pressed by a steady hand. It had been her father's map once, drawn long before the satellites started telling everyone what to believe. The wind hit the left wing, sharp and low. Clara eased into it, angling the plane into a shallow slide. Her grip on the throttle remained steady, cushioned by a folded strip of cloth to keep the cold from numbing her palm. The knobs clicked beneath her touch, each adjustment minor, precise. This wasn't guessing. This was instinct. Beneath her, the terrain shifted. The flatlands had turned to water days ago. Trees stood like drowned sentries, their upper branches still above the floodline, swaying in the wind. Pitched rooftops appeared like islands, some marked with bright tarps, others empty. Clara scanned the shapes, not just for presence but for direction. She watched how the water flowed around them, how it bent and split. It told her more than any data feed. The cloud shelf pressed low, dense and streaked with dusk. Her propeller cut through the rain like a blade. Sound swallowed the moment it left the cabin. Inside, it was all vibration and breath and quiet tension. She flew beneath radar coverage. There was no transponder ping, no tower guiding her in. Her route had never been submitted. Her altitude never cleared. She wasn't on any manifest. But she was here. The village came into view with no fanfare, a series of crumbling stone buildings, half submerged. The largest had a faded mural still clinging to its front wall, a sunburst and bird, almost lost under layers of storm damage. On the rooftop, a blue tarp flapped wildly, tied at all corners, a signal to anyone who knew what it meant. Clara did. She banked low. Her flaps adjusted with a mechanical whine. The crate in the bay shifted slightly as the weight redistributed. She didn't need to check it. She had secured every strap herself, double-knotted and braced. She opened the hatch lock manually, then moved to the release handle. There was no warning tone, no alert, just her eyes on the landing zone and her grip on the lever. The wind kicked once, hard from the right. She compensated instantly, adjusting her angle so that the pontoons would skim instead of slap. The drop point passed beneath her. She pulled. The crate fell true. It struck the rooftop clean, cushioned by the tarp and a stack of old tires placed exactly where her father had once taught the locals to brace for impact. The plane rose again, throttle easing as she gained elevation. She circled once, low and slow, checking for signal panels. She counted 6 people waving. One of them pointed up. She didn't wave back. She adjusted her course. The waterfield near the southern slope looked calmer than expected. The current there moved slower, wider. She angled toward it, gauging the spread. The trees on either side gave just enough clearance. She brought the nose down slowly, flaps fully extended, wheels locked. The pontoons touched the water and skipped once, then settled. Spray rose on both sides, drumming against the undercarriage. The plane slowed naturally, dragging just enough through the debris that it began to drift. Clara adjusted the rudder with the heel of her boot, guiding the aircraft toward the makeshift dock where a few villagers stood ankle-deep, watching. She killed the engine. The propeller wound down in soft, deliberate notes. The sudden quiet felt larger than it was. Rain still tapped against the windows. Wind still moved through the trees. But inside the cockpit, it was only breath and memory. Clara pulled her headset off and placed it beside the map. She removed her gloves. Her hands were steady. Her shoulders dropped slightly, not in relief, but in readiness for what came next. She opened the hatch and stepped out into the rain. The dock was no more than 3 wooden slats nailed to a submerged pallet, tethered to a tree stump. Water reached past her boots in seconds. She moved through it without pause, her flight suit soaked from the knees down by the time she reached the cargo hatch. She opened it by hand. The bay was empty now. Nothing to unload. No ceremony. A child stood nearby, holding onto the sleeve of a taller woman who might have been her mother. The child looked at Clara with wide eyes. Not afraid, not surprised, just watching, as if she had been told stories about this exact kind of arrival. And now it had come true. Clara didn't smile. She didn't speak. She placed her hand once on the hull of her aircraft and looked up toward the sky. The clouds were starting to thin in places. The light had shifted from gray to a dusky amber. The water around the plane rippled outward. Quiet now. No signal had called her here. No system had logged her flight. But the drop was made. The plane had held. The path had opened. And no one else had come. The footage came in just after 6:30 in the evening, passed hand to hand through a chain of volunteers until it reached the comms tent in a battered plastic casing still wet around the edges. A young translator brought it in, breathless, saying only that someone from the village had walked it out through the water to a supply post. He handed the device a phone, cracked at the corner, screen flickering every few seconds to one of the junior techs at the map table. "Someone filmed the drop," the translator said. "They said no one else came. Just her." The room didn't react at first. Background chatter still hummed from the comms station, and the monitors looped static-laced aerial feeds that hadn't changed in hours. Colonel Adrian stood by the whiteboard, marker still in hand, halfway through drafting a reroute plan that would never happen. The technician wiped the phone screen with his sleeve, cradled it carefully, and plugged it into the auxiliary display feed. The first 5 seconds were garbled a slow pan across rooftop tiles, wind buffeting the microphone. Then the image steadied. Through a curtain of mist, a gray hull cut across the sky low and close, wings flexing in the updraft. The camera shook with excitement. In the corner of the frame, a child's voice shouted something unintelligible in the local dialect. Then the tarp rippled. The crate dropped. There was no caption, no timestamp, no overlay, just the image of Clara's waterplane skimming over the floodplain like it had done it 100 times before. The tail number flashed clear just once, backlit by the sinking sun. 133. No logo. No insignia. Derek stepped closer, his jaw tightening. "What is that? That's not... That can't be from today." The junior officer next to him leaned in. "That's the village we scrubbed. Look at the roof layout." Colonel Adrian set the marker down. "Replay it." The technician dragged the footage back and let it roll again. Slower. This time. They all saw the details. The angle of the wings as the plane dipped just above treetop level. The glint of a face through the cockpit glass. The drop. Clean and steady. The crowd on the rooftop raising their hands as if welcoming something they'd waited for but didn't expect. Derek blinked fast, folding his arms. No one cleared that airframe. That plane wasn't even listed. She wasn't on the schedule, someone said behind him. There's no log for her launch. A press liaison stepped in from the media side of the tent, her voice tight. That aircraft's not tied to any of the documented relief teams. We need to figure out who authorized that flight before this gets posted. We can't show rogue actors bypassing coordination. She's not a rogue actor, said the translator quietly. She's from here. Adrian turned back to the main screen. He didn't speak, didn't blink, just stared at the grainy footage playing in a slow, uneven loop. Another officer pulled up the mission manifest. Page after page rolled by on the secondary monitor jet teams, drone schedules, crew rosters, but no mention of Clara. Not on paper, not in code, not in tags. The translator moved closer to the screen, watching it again. They said she didn't speak, just landed, unloaded, and left. A moment passed where no one breathed quite right. Derek tried again. That aircraft can't be in spec. It's an antique. You can't pull off a corridor drop in a plane that size without telemetry or... She did, Adrian said flatly. We're looking at it. The junior officer pointed to the corner of the footage. Zoom here. Look at the stabilizer movement. She's flying against shear and correcting manually. No automated assist. That's control by feel. Another screen flickered to life beside the main monitor. A diagnostics technician had cross-referenced the tail number. The database returned an outdated airframe file from over a decade ago. Decommissioned. No digital flight history. No recorded ownership since Clara's independent purchase. Below the record, a red icon blinked. Unverified. Derek stepped back. She wasn't cleared. If she went in, she did it without permission. That's a liability. If anything had gone wrong. It didn't, Adrian said, and no one else got through. In the silence that followed, the phone footage played one more time. This time with no audio. Just whine through the trees and the sudden sharpness of that gray plane cutting across the screen. Almost mythical in its arrival. There was no music, no angle adjustment, just truth. The translator whispered something in his language, barely audible. The child who had filmed the video could be seen in the final seconds. The phone lowered slightly, capturing her own hand outstretched, palm open, as Clara's plane drifted into the background. One officer turned and checked the main flight log. Still no entry, no call sign, no departure time. But on the communications console, a static burst flickered. Just for a moment, one faint return echo. A single number scrolled across the bottom of the diagnostic overlay. 133. The system had picked it up on approach. Just too late to tag it. Adrian took a slow breath. Get this footage downloaded. Archive it with full metadata, and don't release anything. Not yet. The press liaison stepped forward. Do we issue a correction? We told our donors the zone was still unreachable. Adrian's voice didn't change. Then let them wonder how it wasn't. Derek walked out of the tent without another word. The technician dimmed the monitors. The final loop froze mid-frame, Clara's plane tilting gently as the crate landed, water spray catching golden light behind it. The tent was silent now. No movement. No commentary. Just the truth suspended in pixels. No one had given her orders. No one had signed her out. She hadn't reported her success, but the world had seen it anyway. And it had been enough. The sky had begun to soften by the time Clara's waterplane appeared over the trees, its shape barely outlined in the amber haze of the sinking sun. There were no lights on the runway, no crew waiting at the edge with flags or signals. The airfield had settled into the stillness of a long day, ending in half measures and closed statements. Somewhere far off, the generators had powered down to half capacity. Most of the tents stood zipped and dark. Her plane glided across the strip without a word, its pontoons skimming a ribbon of standing water left by earlier storms. She eased back on the throttle and let the weight of the aircraft do the rest. The propeller slowed, its rhythm deepening with each revolution until the engine coughed once and quieted. The plane rolled to a stop at the far edge of the pad, just shy of the boundary line where the gravel began. Clara opened the hatch and stepped out onto the float, boots still soaked from the landing. She glanced toward the hangar. No one had moved. No one had noticed. A breeze rolled across the field, low and warm, and the sky above turned the color of rust and violet. She climbed down carefully, using the frame instead of the ladder. The tarmac felt warm under her soles. Her steps were slow, not from fatigue, but from the kind of stillness that settles after something ends and does not need explanation. She walked the length of the aircraft, pausing once to check the straps that had held the final crate. They were empty now, curled slightly from where the tension had been. She ran her fingers across the bay wall, then closed the hatch and latched it by hand. A young technician at the opposite end of the field looked up briefly. He was carrying a box of cables toward a parked drone rig and froze for half a second when he saw her. She didn't wave. She didn't call out. He stared for a moment, uncertain, then continued walking without a word. Clara reached the hangar just as the last of the light disappeared from the sky. Inside, the air was still and familiar. The shadows were long across the concrete. The tarp she had folded earlier lay where she'd left it, untouched. She stepped out of her boots and left them beside the bench. Her socks were soaked through, so she peeled them off and placed them under the edge of the fuel lantern to dry. Her father's map was still pinned to the crate near the back. The grease pencil hung from a nail above it. She walked to the map, eyes moving across the penciled route. Every bend and valley memorized, now in motion rather than drawing. Her finger found the small X again, the one marked safe water. She reached for the pencil, uncapped it, and drew a single check mark beside it. Nothing dramatic, just one clean line. The fuel lantern buzzed softly in the corner. Its light cast warm shadows against the metal ribs of the roof. A gust of wind pushed through the broken vent above the tools and carried the smell of wet concrete and old oil across the room. Somewhere inside the walls, a bird had made a nest. She could hear its wings flutter as it settled in for the night. She sat down at the table beside the map and reached for her logbook. The cover was cracked, the corners rounded from use. She flipped past pages marked with dates and locations no one else tracked. Drops in mountain passes, night flights into river basins. No spectators, just notes. She turned to the last page, uncapped her pen, and wrote a single word: complete. Then she closed the book and slid it back into the drawer beneath the chartboard. Her tea kettle still sat on the workbench. She filled it with bottled water from a crate and set it on the burner, twisting the knob until the flame caught with a soft whoosh. As it heated, she leaned back against the bench and looked out through the open hangar doors. The field stretched wide, empty and quiet. The same jets that had taken off earlier sat idle, their wings now blue in the dusk light. She thought briefly of the voices from the tent, the names called and logged, the plans shifted and erased. None of them had seen her leave, and none of them would need to hear her return. She reached up and untied her flight cap, setting it beside the kettle. Her hair fell to her shoulders, damp and pulled slightly by the weight of the day. The steam from the kettle rose slowly. The sound of it, soft and regular, reminded her of the rivers they used to fly over, together, her father in the pilot seat, her feet barely touching the floor. She didn't feel triumphant. There was no pride, no resentment either. Just the kind of quiet that comes when the work is done and the result speaks for itself. The kind of quiet that doesn't require acknowledgement. Outside, one of the drone towers blinked once, then dimmed. A maintenance cart rolled by, slow and rattling, its operator not looking her way. Clara poured the hot water into a tin mug and held it between her palms. She didn't drink right away. Just let the warmth reach her fingers. The storm had moved on. The air smelled different now, like wet leaves and distant ash. She listened to the soft tap of water dripping from the wingtips onto the concrete pad. The hangar, once her refuge, now felt like closure. Not an end, but a finish. She didn't need to be listed. She didn't need to be called. The map had been right. The flight had been clean. The drop had been made. She sipped the tea. It tasted slightly of tin and memory. No one applauded. No one asked questions. But the crates were gone. The village had received them. The route she'd flown would not be documented. But it didn't need to be. As the light finally disappeared and the wind quieted, Clara stood, walked back to the plane, and laid one hand on its hull. A thank you. Nothing more. And then she closed the hangar door behind her. She was never called forward, never handed a mission, never recognized on the roster. But Clara knew who she was and what she could do. While others waited for orders, she trusted her hands, her memory, and the quiet lessons passed down from a father who taught her to read the sky without instruments. In a world that valued credentials over instinct, she flew anyway. And when every other flight turned back, it was her forgotten waterplane that broke through the storm. This is not just a story about landing where others would not. It is a reminder that strength does not always arrive with noise or permission. Sometimes, the ones who go unseen are the very ones who carry others to safety. If this story moved you, share your thoughts in the comments. And follow for more stories about quiet courage and the power of being ready, even when the world is not watching.